I would like to welcome you all to the second week of Drisha's Winter's Zman and the first of two classes called Tasting the Tanakh on the Role of Food in Biblical Narratives by Rabbi Joe Wolfson. Rabbi Joe Wolfson grew up in London and spent 10 years studying, working, and loving life in Israel. He studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion and Beit Marasha, through which he received his smicha from the Israeli chief rabbinate. He thought he was going into politics and did degrees at Cambridge, where he was president of the Jewish Society and UCL. He decided to go into Jewish education and has taught texts on 4 continents, primarily as a faculty member of London School of Jewish Studies. Beyond music, good books, cycling, and HBO, Rabbi Joe is passionate about the ways in which texts link up to larger issues of Jewish identity. He has worked in areas as diverse as Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religious secular relations in Israel, and European Jewish communities. And without further ado, Rabbi Joe Wolfson.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me, everybody. Very excited to learn with everybody. Realized that my bio is quite a while out of date. I should have asked Shlomo Zukia before he said, should we just use the old bio to see what it was? That was correct as of about 2015. So a few things have happened in the last 5 years. Primarily, we live in downtown Manhattan. My wife and I are the JLIC couple and directors at New York University. So everything to do with downtown Jewish Manhattan is what I've been very much concerned with in the last few years. And I've done some wonderful teaching at Drisha back in the world when we could do things in person, would have its summer kollel at the Bronfman Center where we work, and it was a privilege to teach as part of that. And perhaps most significantly and relevantly for this, we love food very much. Whilst I was studying for smicha, for my rabbinic ordination, my wife Corrine was training at Tadmor, which is Israel's main culinary institute, and she worked as a chef for several years, and it was a shared thing, shared love as well. So very excited to be a part of this. Like Sarah said, if you are happy and able to put your screens on, that would be wonderful. Learning online is much more satisfying, and I find it much easier when we're able to still feel we've got something of a group connection. And if there isn't noise in your background, you're also welcome to unmute yourselves as well, even if you haven't got anything to say. You know, from the perspective of a teacher, you know, we want to pick up on as much as possible. You know, if I say something and there's sort of like an intake of breath or a Marge Simpson style grumble, you know, that's a piece of data that I want, and it helps me respond to it as well. So this is me coming in fresh. This is my first 4 minutes of Drisha's Winter Zman, and I assume that the majority of you have already spent a good amount of time in the last 10 days, considering the links between Jewish texts and ideas and identity and food. So I consider you all much more equipped for this than I am, and I want to gain from your knowledge and the like. Has there been? I did listen to Rabbi Silber's piece on Sunday. Apart from that, has there been much focusing on Tanakh itself, on role and ideas of food in the Bible?
Not a ton. There's been a lot on more Talmud.
All right, good. So we're going to be going back to basics then. That will be wonderful. Perhaps rather than going around at the start and everybody saying where you are and where you're from, I'd like to ask people to really be sort of involved, and whenever you do speak, please do introduce yourself and say where you're from. So we've got 2 classes together, today and Thursday. And my idea is as follows. I thought we would begin with, and I'm not sure if it will take up all of today or just a part of today, we would begin with sort of like an overview of just trying to think how many different ways or how many different roles food plays in Tanakh, in a whole variety of different places, of different sort of significance, what sort of literary function it might have. And we're going to look at a good number of sort of themes and ideas. And then I thought with the rest of today's class and Thursday, or perhaps just Thursday, we're going to focus on two stories, two sort of deep dives, if you like, where food is at the center of the narrative, and understanding what its role is going to deeply enrich in our understanding of that story. So perhaps I'll open the floor up to you all to begin thinking. When we run these two ideas together, we say Tanakh, the Bible, which we love to read, which we love to live, and food, where are the meeting points between the two? And just, I guess what I should say, I'm thinking primarily of narrative. I'm not thinking for now of, say, korbanot, the sacrifices, which of course are food, which is very interesting. Not our discussion for now. I'm not thinking of kashrut and tuma and tahara, rules, laws of food, which is permitted, forbidden, pure, impure. That's not exactly where I want to go right now. What are you thinking of the roles that food plays in biblical stories? Let's just sort of throw some ideas out together, and then we'll do some jumping in. Please don't be shy.
I was thinking of the Omer, the wheat, growing the wheat and counting the Omer.
Do you want to expand a little bit on that, Enid?
Well, it's food, and it's not food you can eat in its form, but it shapes. It's a central point of the agricultural society because it needed to be guarded. Probably the guarding started and had to do with the marauders around. As the wheat got better and better, it was more likely to be stolen and harmed. I don't know if that makes sense, but basically that's what I was thinking.
That's great. That's excellent. And I think it also gives us an introduction into just a much larger theme, really a huge theme, which you're touching upon, which is that the Tanakh is primarily, for much of its narrative, an agrarian society. Agriculture and the production of food is at the heart of what is done, fundamentally different to the way in which most of us live today. So that's the setting, and something like the Omer plays a big role in that. Yehudi, you have your hand raised.
Yes. I'm assuming you're talking about food and biblical narrative. So if that's the case, let's just start with Sefer Bereshit. The first thing you hear about is a food story. You're allowed to eat this, but you're not allowed to eat that. And when you eat that, you get yourself into trouble. And then we have stories of Avram Avinu sitting and eating Malki Tzedek's lechem v'yayin. And then we have the whole story of the big feast that Yitzchak wants to have before he blesses Esav and ends up there. Everything is described in the most lavish detail imaginable. And in other words, Sefer Bereshit has all types of food stories. You have Yosef sitting down with his brothers and getting drunk and eating a whole big meal. In other words, there's no end of stories in a narrative where food becomes central, especially when you want to have a Brit. A Brit never takes place without some food. Even in Brit Ben Habatarim, Hashem eats the food, so to speak, when the fire passes between the pieces. So I think food is absolutely central in biblical narrative, if that's really what you're intending to talk about. I'm not sure.
That is exactly right, except that your point is so good in that it obviously forces us to know what to not, the trouble being what to not include. Indeed, one could give a whole year's course of food stories in Sefer Bereshit alone. You're quite right. So I think what we're going to try and do is to try and not simply just look at individual instances, but rather to connect them into larger themes and see what will emerge. But I mean, let's perhaps just go for your first example, and there are many. The Torah could have chosen multiple ways in order to describe the first failure of humanity. Adam and Eve in the garden doesn't need to focus on food, but instead, as Yehudi rightly says, both the original command, from all the trees of the garden you shall eat, from that tree you shall not, and the I don't want to use the word fall, but the inability to listen to that command focuses upon eating when it could have focused upon anything else. That's a very interesting theme, and I think it's one we'll probably return to. Another one which Yehudi mentions is that eating as the sealing of a deal, of a covenant, of a brit, is shared between agreements between persons, people, and between humanity and God. Fascinating that that should be something which is shared. I see some other comments in the chat. Food as temptation leading to downfall of Adam, Noah, Esav. Interesting, great. So that's a fantastic idea of food as a theme, food as temptation. Abraham telling Sarah to get food prepared for guests. Excellent. We will come to that in a second. Anybody else want to share any sort of what they think of as broad themes, not just individual stories, but something which can sort of track across a larger area?
I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Please, Steve.
Well, first, I wanted to comment. I love your refrigerator and all the notes on there and everything else.
I'm in my kitchen, yeah.
But that actually is part of my point, because I don't think, when the law was given at Mount Sinai, they could have envisioned what kosher was today, with multiple sets of dishes and Passover dishes. And if you just go to the OK Kosher website, you see the history of kosher. And I think, and then the diaspora, I think like geography affected foods. I'm just wondering, this might not be the place, but if you could just some historical context to how kosher and food evolved. I mean, there was no refrigeration for ages. There was spices and preservatives. Glatt kosher is a recent occurrence and all of that. So I think technology has made kosher like more complicated in terms of all these laws and whatnot. And I'm just wondering historically if you can give some context to, like, I can't imagine people used to have like multiple sets of dishes.
Great question, Steve. I do think it is probably, I apologize for the background of sirens outside the window. Thus is downtown Manhattan. I think your question is fascinating and so important. I think it's probably a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm able to do today, which is going to focus primarily on stories. I'm very happy to message offline if you like. I'll put my address, my email address in the chat afterwards. I was reading a review of a book yesterday which recently came out, which you might find interesting, Steve. It's called Feasting and Fasting, a social history of Jews and food, which has a significant section on that. I'll put a link to that as well in the chat. Okay. I want to begin and with sharing a few different themes, and we're going to move through them quite quickly. We're not going to go too deep on any of them, but I would like, I hope that they will give us a strong sense of sort of the multiple ways in which food comes to the fore. I'm trying to share it, but it doesn't look like I'm able to. So I guess people are, oh, there we go. Now I am screen sharing. Okay, people see my doc? Thank you. Lovely. So here's the first theme I want to talk about, and it was already partly mentioned, but I want to jump deep on it. Food seems to be the axis in the Tanakh, or the axis, the way in which sort of a fundamental way in which we think about different forms of society. Whether a society is a kind, hospitable society or a cruel, avaricious one, very much takes place through the notion of food. So let's look at a classic text, one which I think was already mentioned in the chat and by Yehudi. And it's a beautiful text and one which is worth picking up on some nuance. Avraham is sitting in his tent, Belonei Mamre, Kachom Hayom, in the heat of the day. He has recently had his Brit Milah, his circumcision. Visa, he's speaking to God. Vayar elav Hashem, God appears to him. That's verse 1. Verse 2, Vayisa einav, raises his eyes. Vayar v'hinei shelosha anashim nitzavim alav. There are 3 men standing there. Vayar, he sees them. Vayaratz likratam mipetach ha'ohel, runs to greet them. Vishtachu arza, bows down. Vayomar, and he says to them, Adoni, my masters, imna matzati chen be'einecha, if I found pleasure, if it pleases you, al nata avorm alavdecha, please don't pass by. Yukach namat mayim, take a little bit of water. Rachatzu raglechem, will wash your legs. Take some rest. Ve'chapat lechem, let me fetch a tiny little piece of bread. V'sa'adu libchem, you can eat a little bit, and then you can go on your way. There's also, this is the origin here of sort of Jewish hosts, saying, oh, just a little bit, and then of course what happens? Verse 6, Vayimaher Avraham Ohela runs into Sarah in the tent, says, quick, right? And they have a huge amount of food which is ready to come out. He said, I'll give you a morsel of bread, and he ends up serving a multi-course feast, 3 sayers of flour. We're going to make cakes. There's a calf as well. And the 3 passers-by, who of course turn out to be very significant people, are treated to a great feast. I want to look a little bit more carefully at the opening verses, because I think we're going to see something very interesting. What is the relationship between verse 1 and verse 2? If you see it, see this sort of the slight bumpiness. On the one hand, Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamre, God appears to Abraham, verse 1. On the other hand, Vayisa einav vayar v'hinei shelosha anashim. There are three people, 3 men. Of course, we know from the continuation, these are not just average guys. These are, in fact, angels. These are divine beings who are sent to impart the news that Sarai will have a child. And of course, they are then to go on their way to Sodom, where they are going to bring about the city's destruction. So given their angelic divine quality, the Rashbam, Rabbi Shimon ben Meir, who is the grandson of the great commentator Rashi, says the way to read these verses is as follows: that really verses 1 and 2 describe the same event. God appears to Abraham, verse 1, in the form of these 3 men, verse 2. In other words, they are not describing 2 separate visions. Rather, the divine appearing to Abraham appears in the guise of these 3 men. This is the divine message which is coming to Abraham. Verses 1 and 2 describe the same. And then he goes out and says, please don't pass by, please come in. I want to share, however, the reading of his grandfather, Rashi. Now, the Rashbam may be closer to what we call pshat, to the simple reading, but there is going to be something extremely profound and beautiful, I think, in Rashi's reading of it. Rashi wants to tell us that verses 1 and 2 describe 2 separate occurrences. Vayera elav Hashem. God appears to Abraham. Abraham, being the person who discovers God, this great religious figure, is having a conversation with God, some sort of spiritual, mystical, religious experience. Who knows exactly what that consists of, but Abraham is speaking to God, verse 1. Then, verse 2, he sees people and he wants to host them. He wants to greet them. By the way, did anyone familiar, sorry to jump back 10 seconds, anyone familiar with the Midrashic tradition that Rashi quotes? Why is God appearing to him at this stage? Why is God coming to see Abraham in verse 1? Yes, Yehudi? Yeah,
Bikur
Cholim. Excellent, right? He's visiting the sick. Abraham has had his Brit Milah. Abraham is in the heat of the day, the third day, according to the Midrash, the most painful. Abraham is visited by Hashem to check he's all right. But then Abraham sees these people. The Yisai raises his eyes and he immediately wants to welcome them in, even though he's speaking to God. So now verse 3, according to Rashi's reading, who is, now you have to ignore the English translation here, because the English translation goes with the Rashbam. But in Rashi's reading, the verse is now as follows: Vayomar Adoni, please my Lord, i.e. God, please God, says Abraham. Imna matzati chen be'enecha, if it's okay with you, if you don't mind, al na ta'avom alavdecha, please don't go, wait here for me while I go and get these people. Now, really, you have to see Rashi's language because it's just so beautiful and really, you know, rather radical. Okay. Vayom davar acher kadosh. People see where I'm highlighting? This word Adoni, my masters, sorry, is kadosh. It's holy. It refers to God. He's saying, V'haya omer lahakadosh baruch hu, Abraham says to God, Lahamtin lo, please wait for me. Ad sheyarutz v'yachnis et ha'orchim, until I go and bring in the guests. That is a line to remember, right? You know, in Parashat Vayera, which is sort of the heart of so much of Jewish theology, you know, we talk of the Akedah and Abraham having to sort of subsume his desire to love and look after his son. We talk of Abraham arguing with God at Sodom, right? And these are two very different modes. But actually, in this lovely reading of Rashi, it's an altogether different way of Abraham relating to God. In this moment, Abraham is saying to God, please, sorry, God, can you wait a moment? Can you wait on the side? If you don't mind, I've got something else to deal with. What is that something else? There are guests and I need to feed them. I need to run and make sure they're okay. Hashem waits for Abraham in this reading. It's so beautiful. Abraham puts Hashem on the side for a moment. Something more important is taking place. What is that? Sharing bread with people who are passing by. The reason I asked if anybody knows why Hashem is visiting Abraham was in order to set up the following, which is that in this little exchange, what the Midrash tells us is being taught is that from Hashem we learn Bikur Cholim, but from Abraham we learn Hachnasat Orchim. From God we learn visiting the sick. From Abraham we learn welcoming in guests. Now, there is a reason why this story is juxtaposed to the very next story. Once the angels have imparted their news, their lovely news, but also their sad news about what's going to happen to Sodom, we read of them arriving in Sodom. Vayavo shnei malachim Sodoma. The angels come to Sodom. But Lot Yoshev b'shar Sodom, Lot, Abraham's nephew who has relocated to Sodom, is there. Vayar Lot seeing them, Vayakam nikratam yishtachu apayim, so runs together and bows down to them. Similar to his uncle, who he has of course grown up with, He invites them in. He says, Na Adoni surna el beit avdechem, please come to your servant's house, to me. Linu rachatzu raglechem, come in, have my hospitality. And of course, the residents of Sodom do not like this one little bit. Lot welcomes in the guests, but the residents of Sodom do not like this, do not like it one little bit. There is a tradition that Rashi quotes that well, in fact, we'll leave Rashi for a moment. The predominant tradition and reading as to why it is that the residents of Sodom cannot abide Lot having taken them in is that Sodom, it seems to be the absolute opposite of what Abraham represents when it comes to Hachnasat Orchim and the way in which guests are viewed, or rather the way in which the sharing of resources is viewed. A person or a society which has its land and has its food, how should they relate to those who are in need? I want to show two midrashim, because the midrashim, they're very similar to one another, but they pull out something different. In the previous chapter, God has said he needs to go down and see. The cry of Sodom has arisen before me. And I want to go down and see. Eredna ve'ereh hakatzakata has the cry of Sodom. Is it really true? Here is one midrash. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, this is from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Hechrizu beSodom. It was announced in Sodom. Kol mishu machzik b'pat lechem. Anybody who has got some bread and gives it la'ani ve'le'evyon, to a poor person in need, person hungry, yisaref ba'esh, will be burned. This is the punishment. We now hear about Pelitat bito shel Lot, one of Lot's daughters, called Pelitit. Nesua le'echad migdolei ha'ir, married to one of the well-known people of the city. Rata ani medakdek berechov, seeing a poor man, a hungry man in the street. Va'agma nafsha alav, and she felt for him. Master, so what was it that she did? And she grew up in Lot's house, of course, who himself grew up in Abraham's house. V'chol yom hayta yotza lishov, she'd take out for him. Hayta notenet v'kad shela, she'd put into her basket. Mikol mazon beita, all of the food of the house. U'ma'acheret lo ani, and give it to this poor man each day. She would feed him. Amru anshe Sodom, the people of Sodom said, Ha'ani hazeh, this poor man, Me'ein hu chai, how is he able to carry on living? Uchshiyadu b'davar, when they found out that it was through Lot's daughter, hotziu ota lehisaref, they took her out to burn her. Amra, she cried out, Ribon kol ha'olamim, master of the universe, aseh mishpati, look at my case, v'dini me'anshe Sodom, look what they are doing to me. Va'alta tza'akata lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, her cry went up to God. Tosha, at that moment, Abar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Erda na ve'ereh, I will go down and see im ketza'akat hana'ara hazot atzu anshe Sodom. If, in accordance with this young woman's cry, if it is what she's saying is true, is how they are acting, if so, then I will turn Sodom up and down. I will turn it over. That's one midrash. I want to show you another midrash which is very similar, but has got a fascinating nuance. It doesn't focus on Lot's daughter, but again, it focuses on two young women. That's not the one I wanted. I'm getting lost deep in Safaria. Fine, not so important that I have it. Essentially, the second midrash says, even if I wanted to be merciful to Sodom, it is this cry of the oppressed, of those who are being abandoned by their society, which is too much for me, which I cannot take. And in fact, this is not only a midrashic, a later rabbinic commentary, it seems to be even internal to the Tanakh itself. Let me make this a little bit bigger. The text seems to be a little small here. Here is Yechezkel. Ezekiel, looking back 1,000 years or so to the time of Abraham, and he tells the Jewish people who have been exiled from their land in the time of Yechezkel, what is it that happened to those who used to inhabit this land? The people of Sodom, for instance. Chayani, as I live, Ne'um Hashem Elokim, Imasta Sodom achotech, your sister Sodom. What did she do? Hine zeh haya avon Sodom achotech. Only this was her sin. Gaon, her pride, her arrogance. Sivat lechem, she had so much bread. V'shalvat hashket, untroubled tranquility. Hayala ulevnoteha, did she and her daughters have. V'yad ani ve'evion lo hechzika. But the poor, the hungry, she gave nothing to. This seems to set up, I would like to claim, and it sort of, maybe it almost seems sort of so basic, but it sets up what I think is a core theme of the Tanakh, that the way in which we're able to see the difference between a society which the Torah wants us to strive towards and a society which the Torah wants us to absolutely reject is how that society relates to its abundance, to its food, and to those who are hungry, those who are in need. And perhaps we can actually pull out something here. It's not simply is food shared, is food given to those who are hungry. It's not that there's a government feeding program. Hospitality is not just about the provision of food to those who are hungry. It's much more than that. It's opening up one's home as well. Abraham sort of is clearly the embodiment of that. Is anyone familiar with a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which describes the character of Sodom, the attribute of Sodom? Does it ring a bell for anybody?
Mhm.
The Mishnah in Avot says, Alba midot ba'adam. There are 4 ways of being in the world. And then it sets itself up with the difference between sheli and shelcha. What's the relationship between mine? What's the relationship between yours? And the first one is as follows. Ha'omer sheli sheli v'shelcha shelcha. One who says what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. Zumida beinunit. This is a very average attribute. This is neither particularly kind and altruistic. It's also not particularly wicked. Just what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. But then it says, V'yesh omrim, however, there are those who say, Zumidat Sodom. This is the attribute of Sodom. And that's a very interesting Mishnah, because it's not sort of like an elaborate midrashic, exaggerated attack on the cruelty of the people of Sodom. In fact, it makes Sodom very similar to what is found amongst very many of us. What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. Isn't just something which is average. That is the attribute of Sodom. If what you see with your own plenty is a big barrier which stops you from giving it and sharing it with others, that is the attribute of Sodom. This develops in other ways as well. We'll do this one very quickly. Nations that are not part of the Jewish people, of course, are given the option of converting, with the exception of 2. Anyone remember which these 2 nations which are not able to become a part of the Jewish people?
Yeah, Moabite and
Moab and Edom.
Exactly, Moab and Edom. I'll share my screen again. Here we are in Devarim. Lo yavo Ammoni v'Moavi b'kahal Hashem. These 2 nations, Ammon and Moab, cannot come into the Jewish people. Gamdo asiri lo yavo lahem, even up to 10 generations. Why? Al davar asher lo kidmu etchem balechem uvamayim. For the fact that they did not give you bread and water, b'derech tzeitchem mimitzrayim, when you left Egypt. That cruelty, that refusal to provide even just a basic amount of food, bars them from being a part of the Jewish people. It is the ultimate anti-Avraham mode of behavior. Who is it in Tanakh who seems to buck this trend, who nevertheless joins the Jewish people from one of these nations?
Ruth.
It is, of course, Ruth. Exactly right, Enid.
Yeah.
And it's not by chance, I would suggest and argue, that Ruth personifies this kindness, this giving, this sharing of food with her mother-in-law. It is her ability to completely invert the behavior of the society which she supposedly comes from, which is what grants her this entry into the Jewish people. Again, this is just a very quick overview, looking at lots of different themes. One of my very favorite stories of Tanakh, but one which is not taught so much, is the story of what's called the Witch of Endor, Balat Or. Are people familiar with it?
Mm-hmm.
The very end of Shaul's life, King Saul, the first king, at the end of the first book of Samuel, Shmuel Aleph. Shmuel is terrified about the battle which he is to engage in the next day. And he goes to this sorceress who is one of the pagan peoples who is able to call up, at least as she claims, call up from the dead those who have departed. And he goes to her and says, please call up Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, who was my guide back in previous days. We were not going to go into the whole story now, and there's great discussion amongst the commentators whether or not it happens. It's absolutely fascinating. But what's amazing is that this pagan sorceress is presented as just being the loveliest, kindest person. If you can see these verses which I've put from it, we don't need to read them too much in depth, but the parallel to Abraham, to the text which we've just seen, is very, very strong, right? The way she speaks to Shaul, this terrified Israelite king who, as a little bit of background, has persecuted her people, is exactly how Abraham speaks to those who are passing by. She says, please listen to me. Let me give you just a pat lechem, a little bit of bread. He says, let me give you a little bit of bread. Just as Abraham then, having said he'll give a little amount, ends up providing a huge feast, a fattened calf, so too does she. She makes cakes as well. She gives him strength. He goes on in the nighttime, just as they do. Look at this wonderful quote from Josephus. Lovely when Josephus recounts the history of the Jews. Would anybody like to read it? Give me a little break from talking. Enid, you're on my screen. Would you like to?
Okay, sure. Now it is only right to reflect upon the generosity of this woman. The king had forbidden her to use her art that allowed her to improve her circumstances, and yet she did not hold this against him and did not refuse him as a stranger. But she had compassion upon him and comforted him and exhorted him to do what he was greatly averse to, and earnestly and with great humanity offered him the only calf she had, even though she was a poor woman. Furthermore, she expected nothing in return for her kindness, nor hunted after any future favor from him, for she knew that he was to die. Whereas men are naturally eager to please those that bestow benefits upon them, or are very ready to serve those from whom they may receive some advantage. It would be well, therefore, to imitate the example of this woman and to do kindness to all who are in need, and to think that nothing is better nor more fitting for mankind than such a general beneficence that will also render God favorable and ready. And I've lost you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. But you just a couple words left.
Okay, back we are.
Ready to bestow good things upon us. That's a paragraph.
I was quickly looking for a recording of a class I gave on this story to put in the chat. I'll share it afterwards. Thank you so much, Enid.
Okay.
I spoke once to Moshe Halbertal, great, wonderful man, professor of Jewish thought at Hebrew U and NYU, who wrote a book on the book of Shmuel a few years ago. And he said that she is the only character in the whole book of Shmuel who really sort of acts without any sort of political motivation. There's just an element of sort of pure altruism in her. And again, if Ruth is seen as bucking the character trait of the society she comes from, Moab, this is even more extreme of how this is a pagan sorceress who Shaul has persecuted her people and banned her magic, and the Torah bans her magic, and yet the portrayal of her, because she acts like Abraham, is just so sympathetic. But this really sort of jumps out at us. So I'm steaming through all of these sources, and we're going to go through a whole bunch more. But I do want to say, please jump in at any point, right? Consider this a meal, right? We're all talking and thinking and arguing together. If you've got thoughts and ideas about the text that we're seeing, or something occurs to you when you see it, please do share. Okay, so the one I've shown until now, I think, is, don't want to oversay it, sort of pretty obvious. My guess is most of you have heard prior to today that Abraham is hospitable and we should try to emulate. Right? We've done that. We've seen that. The following is I think quite a bit more nuanced, or not nuanced. It's harder to, it's not as obvious to the eye, but once you see it, it's very, very clear. Eating is not something in Tanakh that only people do, that only living beings do. It is something that the land can do as well. And it can also do it in acts of violence. The land can devour, or the land can puke out, can vomit out. Sorry, I didn't see who said that. Somebody said? B.E., I see. What is your name, B.E.?
Beth.
Beth, thank you, Beth. So here we're going to look at something very interesting. The Tanakh seems to have a sort of game, mischak, where what it is that the land does to its inhabitants who do not act as they should varies depending upon which land it is. The Jewish people are told in Vayikra, "Ushmartem atem et chukotai v'et mishpatai." You will keep my statutes. V'lo ta'asu mikol ha'torah asher ha'ela, not to do all as the vile things that the previous inhabitants of this land have done. Ki kol ha'torah ha'ela asu anshe ha'aretz asher lifnechem, those who lived in the land before you did them. V'titameh ha'aretz, they defiled the land. V'lo taki ha'aretz v'tamachem, the land shall not spit you out, or really it's more physical than that. It shall not puke you out, right? What does the land of Israel do to those who defile it with their behavior? The Sefaria translation is spew you out. They puke you out. That's what the land of Israel does. Vomit. However, not so other lands. Slightly later on in Vayikra, Moshe tells the people, "Va'avadatem bagoyim," you will become lost in these foreign lands to which you are exiled. Va'achla etchem eretz oivechem, the land of your enemies shall devour you. Two deeply negative, problematic metaphors to do with eating, of what the land is going to do to those who do not act as the land needs them to do, but very interestingly different from one another. Assimilation in foreign lands is compared to being devoured, to being completely absorbed. The land of Israel is sort of presented as a sensitive body. It's unable to take certain foods, certain ways of behavior. Now look at this cool thing. What happens with the spies? The spies who, of course, bring back their report of the land of Israel. Ha'anashim asher alu imo amru, the people who went with them, the other spies said, Lo nuchal la'alot el ha'am hazeh. We cannot go against this people, those who are already in the land. Chazak hu mimenu, they're much too strong for us. V'yotziu dibat ha'aretz asher toru ota, they spoke ill of the land that they had toured, el bnei Yisrael lemor. They said, Ha'aretz asher avarnu ba, the land which we went through, la torta, eretz ochelet yoshveha. It's a land which devours its inhabitants. The people we saw in it, and Shemot, people of great might. Can anyone see what's just happened? What have the spies just done? If we're to continue the wordplay.
They just described described Eretz Israel as a devouring force, opposed to a sensitive body.
Right, exactly. They attach to it the phrase that is associated with other lands. Right? Bamidbar comes after Vayikra. The way in which I first learned this from my teacher, Dr. Yael Ziegler, her read of it, which has always stayed with me, I thought very compelling, is the spies are not making things up. But what this sort of verbal slip shows is that they are relating to the land of Israel in the way with the sort of the yardstick, the filter, which should apply to other lands, or which to other lands. They are not granting it its sort of uniqueness, which is, of course, the whole point of the narrative in Bamidbar. They are not having the faith that this will be different. So they're calling it Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha, a land which devours its inhabitants, gives the lie to that. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, questions, disagreements? Sparking any ideas yet?
Yes, can you just, hello?
Please, Elizabeth.
Yes, can you just repeat the last part where it's not what they are saying is not true necessarily, but it's not presenting the positivity you're saying?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, the challenge when we're doing something like this, we're rushing through lots of different narratives in order to try and see the themes, is that these are all complex and fascinating stories in their own right, which have got multiple levels in them. And if we're only describing them briefly, then we can oversimplify them. But the reading of the spies, which I was sort of suggesting, was as follows, that one could read it in other ways and put different emphases, but what I was suggesting was as follows, that from a sort of political perspective, a political analysis, what the spies say could be seen to make a lot of sense. We don't have the strength. We will not be able to achieve this. But in the context of the book of Bamidbar, it's not a failure of political analysis or military analysis. It's a failure of religious faith. It's a failure of the ability to understand that just as God has been with them from Egypt until now, so will he be with them as they enter into the land. And this phrase that they use, Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha, this verbal slip, can be read to imply, or can be read to sort of to reveal that they are not looking at the land of Israel as unique and different and under God's special guidance, but rather they are looking at it as one could look at any other country around that would be around them, in which the normal rules of politics and military analysis apply. You know, I guess, you know, maybe I'm overloading it, it just seems very interesting that the spies, and what clearly is viewed by the Torah as a problematic speech, apply to the land of Israel a phrase which is used about other lands. The land, I mean, sorry, M. Lewis. How do you like me to? Should I call you Lewis? Should I call you M?
Oh, Lewis, yeah.
Lewis. Perhaps Lewis put it much more simply than I did. Perhaps there's something really important to the idea that the land of Israel is deeply sensitive to behaviors, which so much so that it will spit them out, whereas other lands devour whatever it is that comes into their path. And perhaps I should stick closer with that reading, with Lewis's reading, that they're thinking of it as any other land. They're thinking of it as something which can just take in anything, and we will be devoured just as we would be devoured in other lands, rather than viewing it as a place which, if you live in a certain way and you build a certain sort of moral religious society, you will stay in it, and if you don't, that is what will get you vomited out from it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anyone else? Let's carry on then for a sec and look at some other themes. We are. Let me share the screen again. A further theme, which seems to definitely be pronounced, is that in the Tanakh, food can quite frequently be a sort of a foil, or seem to be a reference to sex and sexuality. Perhaps there's no better place to see this than in the story of Yosef in Potiphar's house. Chapter 39 of Bereshit. For Yosef hurad Mitzrayma, taken down to Egypt. V'yikanehu Potiphar saris paro, purchased by Potiphar. Sar hatabachim. That's cool, right? Chief steward. Sar hatabach, head of the kitchens. Ish Mitzri miyad ha'ishmaeli. Now Yosef is very successful. God was with him. Everything he touched turned to gold. His master Potiphar sees this. Everything he touches, matzliach, he's successful with. Verse 4, V'yimtza Yosef chen be'enav. Yosef finds favor in his master's eyes, puts him in charge of the whole house. Kol yeshlo, everything he had, natan b'yado. And from that moment that he puts him in charge of the house, V'yivarech Hashem et bet hamitzri b'glal Yosef. God blesses the Egyptian's house. Kol asher lo b'bayit b'sadeh, everything he had in the house, in the field. Verse 6. V'ya'azov kol asher lo b'yad Yosef. He leaves everything that he has in the hands of Yosef. V'lo yada ito mu'uma, everything, ki im halechem, except for the bread, asher hu ochel, that he eats. V'yihi Yosef yafeh to'ar v'yafeh mareh. And Yosef was very beautiful. Why not the bread? Why is the bread not included in everything that he puts him in charge of? So you could suggest a couple of things. Anyone want to make a suggestion?
Yeah, I'll
Why
make
is he
a
in
suggestion.
charge of the bread? Yes.
Okay. It may be because kilo yuchlun hamitzrim le'achal im ha'ivrim lechem ki toevahi l'mitzrayim.
That is excellent. Later on, we will hear that the Egyptians will not eat their bread with others. And then, I guess, to take that a step further, bread emerges from ancient Egypt. Probably the greatest contribution that Egypt gave to the world was the discovery of bread. I mean, this is an important topic in archaeology. It's also an important topic in Tanakh. What Bereshit seems to tell us is that the bread was essential to Egyptian identity and was not something that could be shared with outsiders. That's a very good read of why he would not have given him the bread. Yosef, for all of his qualities, is nevertheless an outsider. By the way, as an aside, this must have something to do with chametz and matzah on Pesach, right? Without a shadow of a doubt, right? That the defining character of Pesach, of leaving Egypt, being this denial of bread. Bread is the ultimate symbol of what ancient Egypt was. Without a doubt, that is correct. Another potential suggestion is that it's not just that Potiphar is Egyptian, he's also a foodie, right? Sar HaTabachim, right? He's head of the kitchens, right?
Mhm.
I'll share with you. I do. There are very, very few people I allow to make my coffee, like you know, and tea. And don't even get started on tea. I mean, I don't think, you know, unless you're from the UK, I would not trust any of you to make me a cup of tea. Don't take it the wrong way. Nothing offensive. I just know that I would not know that. Given all the accents that I've heard so far, I don't think any of you actually know what a cup of tea is. Okay? I'm sure we all have our things. So Potiphar being, you know, Sar HaTabachim, okay, you know, Yosef's excellent at running the house economy, Yosef's excellent at running this. Okay. However, there is this other reading, and it's a reading of Rashi.
Right.
Sorry, did somebody want to?
His wife.
His wife, exactly, right? Let's look at Rashi. Just, it's very short, but it's nice to have it up. Ki im halechem, except for the bread. He ishto, in other words, his wife. Ela shediber halashon belashon nikia, a euphemism is used. Now, before you say that is just midrashic craziness, I'm not so sure. He's successful. He puts him in charge of everything. Ki im halechem, except for the bread. And then the very next words, Vayehi Yosef yafeh to'ar v'yafeh mareh. Yosef is beautiful. Yosef sees himself as beautiful. And the very next verse, she raises her eyes and she says, Shichva imi. The bread, his wife, and this is actually, I should say, just the tip of the iceberg. The biblical scholar James Tuggle has got a whole book about the midrashim of Yosef in Potiphar's house, called In Potiphar's House. One whole chapter is dedicated to food-related midrashim. There is one wonderful one, I'm afraid I didn't get it up, where you know, there's a phrase a little bit later on in the verses, B'chol yom v'yom, this happens every day. Yosef is so beautiful, and Potiphar's wife, she's like tortured by this. Like, it's like she can't, like, it's not simply attraction, like she is just tortured by Yosef's beauty. And the women around her, the neighbors, say, you know, really, this isn't how you should be acting. And so the Midrash describes her inviting them all over one day, and she gives each one of them an apple in one hand, and she gives each one of them a sharp knife to cut the apple. And then she sort of sends a hint to one of the servants, and Yosef walks past all of the Egyptian women, and as she does that, as he walks past, all of their mouths drop open, and they all slice their hands, cut their hands with the sharp knives, and lacerate themselves. I mean, just the sort of the food into sort of attraction, physicality, sexual attraction is just, it's so rich in these.
Rabbi,
Rashi's Kiyam Alechem is just the tip of the iceberg. Yes, Yehudi.
Okay, I'm just because I've clicked the raise hand button, but I'm not sure you see it.
Sorry, pardon me. I did see it. Was just getting engrossed in my cutting the apple midrash. Yes.
Okay. Sar Tabachim might be chief executioner, not chief kitchen steward. Basically, in the Muzardan from Babel is called Rab Tabachim, and I don't think he's made his name as a kitchen steward. It's quite clear that he's a general and he executes people. In the Gilak Eicha, it says Tabachta v'lo chamalta. In other words, that clearly means you killed us without mercy. And not only that, when Yosef is thrown in jail, the jail is just an annex
of Potiphar's house. Don't you see? Where is he? He's in Beisar Tamachim. In other words, all the Potiphar is doing with Yosef is taking him from one wing of the house and putting him in another wing of the house. The back part of the house is the execution, like the west wing and the east wing of the White House. That's what this is. He's not getting rid of Yosef. He knows his wife is making up the whole story. It's not that he doesn't burn, but he can't, he has to get rid of Yosef for show him by it. So he puts it in a different part of the house, and he has Yosef continue to do the things he was doing before, chief administrator of wherever he happens to be assigned, and eventually becomes chief administrator of Egypt. But I don't think that Potiphar means chief kitchen, even though it sure takes that. Which I think is used in Yechezkel, the word matbeach, as, in other words, what I'm saying is that clearly means we're going to kill our enemies. It doesn't mean we're going to cook them or roast them. Matbeach means we're going to kill them. So, and the Buzardan is certainly not a chef. That's not
I
his
agree
job.
with you about Buzardan. I think with Potiphar, you could have it either way. You could view him as an executioner, but you don't get. I think, right now, ani yoshev b'mitbach sheli. I'm sitting in my kitchen. Mitbach, ish tabach. There's a fantastic Kurdish restaurant in Machane Yehuda called Ish Tabach.
What does it mean here?
Let him finish.
Okay? That's the point. In other words, it can mean to slaughter, but it can also mean to kill. And basically, matbeach and mitbach are the same word, but the bottom line is the root tevach. And we have a clear example of Tanakh of Rav Tavachim, who clearly has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
but it doesn't have to. I agree with it as a plausible reading, but I don't think it's the only reading. And many of the midrashim, which are fascinated in the connection between food and the set. I mean, if I'm to push it even further, if you want me to sort of go in the opposite direction, just to sort of see how much the midrashim have a lot of fun with it. Potiphar is described as saris paro, right? Saris meaning a eunuch. In other words, he is not able to provide much in the way of sexual intimacy for his wife. There are other midrashim which then spin off about him being himself attracted to Yosef. All I wanted to do in this was just to show how this is one instant, and there are a number of others elsewhere, where food and sexuality really come together. And of course, what is the other possible one could suggest? And to really go deep on this is beyond the amount of time we have. But what would be the other possible example where sort of food is really essentially a hint at sexuality? And sexuality. Exactly. Right. As soon as they've eaten from the tree, they realize they are naked.
What do they know? They ate from the Eitzadat. What do they know?
Exactly. So the Garden of Eden can certainly be viewed with that in mind. Let's do one other quick one. Now, the following one is going to seem to be sort of like quite a minor idea, but it seems to really be many instances across Tanakh. We have the following, and I'm searching for a particular phrase to catch it. Perhaps you can help me with it. What seems to occur at quite a number of points is after people have committed an act which is a heinous act, a real crime, something which should lead to a real sort of cheshbon nefesh, searching within oneself. That doesn't take place, and instead the opposite happens, which is they sit down and have a good meal.
Yeah, Chaluvayish too.
That's the one. And then we have
one at a time. You heard, not everybody might be jumping as fast as you are, so let's do one at a time. Okay. They throw Yosef into a pit. Yosef and his brothers. Let me just quickly share the screen. They've thrown Yosef into the pit, the brothers. They are hearing his cries, we later learn. But instead, what is it that they do after having thrown him in the pit? Verse 25, V'yeshuvu le'echol lechem. They sit, they eat bread, v'yisu eineihem, they raise their eyes, and they see the caravan which they are going to sell him into slavery into. What is it that they do once they have thrown their brother into the pit? They sit down and have a meal. Here is another one, jumping into a long way away in Tanakh, chapter 3 of Megillat Esther. Haman, whose fortunes have been raised, comes to Achashverosh after feeling humiliated by Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him, says to Achashverosh, Yeshno am echad mefuzar umfarad. There is this people scattered amongst the nations in all of your kingdoms. They have a different religion. They do not do as you do. Im al hamelech tov yikatev la'abdam. If it's good in your eyes, let the king write to annihilate them. Here is money for it. Achashverosh doesn't ask another word. He gives his ring, the signet for it. It's written out. It is sent throughout the empire, transcribed for everybody. Verse 15, the final verse. V'hadat nitna b'Shushan habira. The decree was proclaimed in Shushan. V'hamelech v'haman yashvu lishtot. V'ha'ir Shushan nevacha. The king and Haman sit and drink, and Shushan is confounded. In other words, basically identical really to Yosef and his brothers, and there are many parallels between the story of Yosef and Megillat Esther. One of those parallels is after essentially consigning a person to death or slavery is done, the way of exemplifying this terribly unfeeling response is to sit down and have a feast. If this is so, and there are other examples as well, Yehu with his
example.
Yes, possibly with Shlomo too. I want to show the following one, which is a strange story, and it's not a crime in the same way. Here we are now in Shemot, and this is after or the end of Parshat Mishpatim. Let's sort of get a sense of what's happening here. It's a complicated story. Moshe, I'll go to the beginning of the chapter. Moshe is told to go up to Har Sinai. V'Aaron v'Nadav v'Avihu, to go also with Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu. Miziknei Yisrael. V'shivim miziknei Yisrael, and 70 of the elders. Now they're to go to a certain point, v'ishtachavitem merachok, and to bow down from a distance. After that, v'nigash Moshe levado el Hashem. Moshe alone is supposed to go up. V'hem lo yigashu, but those who come with him will remain where they are. V'ha'am lo yalu imon, the people themselves won't go up at all. So there are 3 levels, right? There's the people down at the base of the mountain. There is Moshe, Aharon, Nadav, Avihu, and 70 elders who go part way up. And then just Moshe who goes up all the way himself. Okay? The next verse is described Moshe telling this to the people. There are offerings. And then the story sort of picks up again in verse 9. Vaya'al Moshe va'Aharon, Nadav v'Avihu, v'shivim miziknei Yisrael. Okay, so this is part 1, right? This is the first group leaving the people at the bottom of the mountain, going part way up. That's verse 9. Moshe, Aharon, Nadav, Avihu, 70 elders. And now watch what happens. The 70, Nadav and Avihu disappear from the story. Let's rejoin at verse 13. We're going to come back to the verses in between. But Nadav and Avihu disappear. Instead, 2 new people emerge. Vayakom Moshe, Moshe gets up. Yehoshua Mashavto, Yehoshua his attendant. Vayal Moshe el har Elohim, and Moshe goes up. Valhazekenim Amar, and he says to the elders, Shvu lanu bezeh, stay here, ad asher nashuv alechem, until we return to you. V'hine Aharon v'Chur imachem, and Aharon and Chur will be with you. If you've got any questions, speak to them. So this is very complex, what's happening. We've got the people there at the bottom of the mountain. We've got the 70 elders who are part way up the mountain. We've got Aharon who is to be with them. Moshe is to go up alone. But then Nadav and Avihu, who are in the story prominently at first, have disappeared and been replaced by Yehoshua and Chur. What's happened? Well, it's complex, but it seems to have something to do with what happens in the middle. After Moshe, we're now in verse 10, after Moshe and Aharon and Nadav and Avihu sort of go up the first way, Vayiru et Elohei Yisrael, they see the God of Israel. I mean, they have this amazing vision of God, like sapphire. They have this vision of the divine, I mean, hard to describe, of course, like the very sky for purity, ke'etzem hashamayim latohar. And now look what happens. Strange verse, verse 11. Ve'el atzilei b'nei Yisrael lo shalach yado. But against this is a rare word, atzilei, translated as leaders, against the leaders of the Israelites, God did not send his hand. Shalach yado meaning to punish. God did not punish these leaders. Ve'yechazu et Elohim, they saw God. Ve'yochlu ve'yishtu, and they ate and they drank. Strange and cryptic, right? This is the suggestion of my teacher, Rav Amnon Azak, appears in this book, which came out a good number of years ago now, Nekudat Pticha, recently released in English, called Parsha Point, I think. He draws our attention to Rashi's comment. Let's look at Rashi. Ve'el atzilei, the leaders, hem Nadav v'Avihu v'hazkenim. This is Nadav and Avihu and the elders. Lo shalach yado, he didn't send his hand against them. Michlal, implying shehayu ru'oyim lishtaleach behem yad, they were deserving of some punishment. V'yechazu et Elohim, they saw God. Hayu mistaklim bo, they looked at God. Belev gas mitoch achila v'shtiya, with a sort of arrogance or an over intimacy, like eating and drinking. And I hope you're beginning to see how this is sort of connected to the Achashverosh, Haman, and Yosef's brothers idea. That the Tanakh seems to have this play of, and it's complex, but it's really worth pulling out, and you know, I'd love to hear people's thoughts. The Tanakh seems to have this play of where eating and drinking after something very significant has happened is a way of showing that you really don't get the significance of what has taken place. You can commit a whole people to annihilation. You can sell a brother into slavery. And the way in which you really show either your heartlessness or your inability to really understand what you should be thinking about is you eat and you drink. And here you have, you know, it's hard for us to find the words to describe it, but people encountering the divine, going up Har Sinai, v'yochlu v'yishtu, and they eat and they drink. Why does God not punish them? Perhaps because this is part of a celebratory atmosphere, but of course this will link up to the story in Vayikra of Nadav and Avihu, who offer, bring forth an offering that they were not commanded, and this sort of desire to come close to God, this over intimacy perhaps, which eventually leads to their downfall, is in some way sort of intimated and hinted at here. And so in this reading, food and drink He's, I mean, I'd be happy if somebody would like to sort of give me the words for it, because I don't exactly have it down. Food, and please, this is an open invitation to anyone. Food and drink is a way of not getting it.
Not getting the point.
What? Sorry, Enid. What were your thoughts?
No, I just said of not getting the point.
Of not getting the point of an over sense of over intimacy, or a lack of sort of kavod, of sort of, you know, the honor due to the moment. And perhaps, I mean, we sort of can have that image, you know, someone just like chomping on a bar as they.
It's like a trivialization. It's
Thank
like a
you.
trivialization of the experience.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, very,
And
very well said.
Also, there's a time and place where we should be celebrating and using food, and there's a time to refrain from it. And that's a lot of our culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. Elizabeth, if I can, I think you take me to the final piece, which we'll do today.
Right.
Which is one chapter, and we're going to go through it quite quickly, but one chapter which seems to be really the richest chapter that there is for thinking about both the possibilities but also the potential dangers of what eating represents. So important, in fact, is this chapter that all of Drisha's Winter's Man is in fact named after a verse from this chapter. This is chapter 8 of Devarim. Moshe telling the people, you've come this far. Verse 2. V'zacharta et kol haderech. You remember the whole way. Asher holichacha Hashem Elokecha ze 40 shana, which God has led you these 40 years in the desert. Leman anotcha, lenatzotcha, to test you. Ladat et asher bilvavcha, to know which is in your heart. V'ya'ancha, it was hard for you. V'yirivecha, you were hungry. V'yachilcha et haman, God fed you the man. What were you to learn from this food, which fell every day, which you had never seen before? Shelo yadata, v'lo yadun avotecha, no one before you had seen it. What was its purpose? Leman hodiyacha, in order to let you know, ki lo al halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam, that not by bread alone does man live. The excellent artisan bakery and the farmer's market that we go to every Sunday is called Bread Alone, right? So one way of reading this verse. Excellent upstate New York bakery. But its origin is, of course, in this verse. Lo al halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. Not through bread alone does a person live. Rather, ki al kol motzeh pi Hashem yichyeh ha'adam. That which comes from God's mouth should a person live through. This bread, this daily bread in the wilderness, showing the origins of it and of our sustenance, and that we cannot survive through bread alone. This takes on a new element now, as we are about to go into a land where there is not manna, but rather one which is an abundance of foods. God is bringing you into a land, verse 7, Tovah, Eretz Nachale Mayim, filled with streams, Eretz Chita Useora, Gefen, Te'ena, Verimon, Eretz Zeit Shem Uduvash, all of the wonderful produce and foods of the land of Israel. Here is a critical phrase you're to eat, verse 17. You should not forget this desert experience of being given the man. Va'amalta, so that you shall not say to yourselves, because you will say to yourselves if you forget it, Kochi va'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. My power, the strength of my hand, did this for me. These are some of the most memorable phrases of the Tanakh for how to think about food and its spiritual dangers. On the one hand, a person might think, Al lechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. A person can live through bread alone. Furthermore, and especially in an agrarian society where food and produce is so much linked to power, producing your own food can lead you to say, Kochi va'otzem yadi asali, my own power, the strength of my hand has given me all of this. I am my ultimate master. There is no room for understanding God's role in everything. But perhaps what's so fascinating is that embedded within this chapter is also the great potential of food. To grow one's own crops, that the land of Israel should be settled as this bountiful land. And verse 10, and here is where we'll finish because it's so important. Va'achalta v'savata uverachta. You shall eat, you shall be satisfied, you shall make a blessing. Achta et Hashem Elokecha, bless Hashem, your God. And I want to emphasize the following point. This is, looked at with halachic glasses, the source for Birkat HaMazon, the blessing said after meals, V'achalta v'savata uverachta. This is what we would call deoraita. It is a Torah level commandment. This is a Torah source for it. Perhaps we think of the most basic way of relating to God, the most obviously Jewish way of relating to God, as being this, the Siddur, the prayer book, Tefillah, prayer, daily prayer. However, with the lone exception of Maimonides, the Rambam, who is of course a very notable exception, but he is alone, there is not a single one of the great medieval authorities who think that the idea of praying daily is a biblical commandment. They all, with the exception of Maimonides, think that it's a later rabbinic injunction, idea to pray every day. And yet, absolutely all of them would agree, they could not disagree, that the blessing after a meal, after food, is biblical in origin. This verse right here in front of us, V'achalta v'savata uverachta, you shall eat, you shall be satisfied, you shall make a blessing. Rav Soloveitchik would put it very simply. In the eyes of the Torah, food is a more natural bridge between people and God, a more natural way of relating to God, of giving voice to our spiritual needs than prayer is. And that, I think, is something which does not seem so obvious to us today, but in the Tanakh is so deeply and powerfully rooted. So with that, we'll finish. V'achalta v'savata uverachta. We've looked at a lot of different themes today. Sarah has saved the source sheet. I think it's fair to say there is not one overarching theme which connects all instances of food in Tanakh. Rather, it brings together many different elements. What we will do next time on Thursday will be much less of sort of getting a panoply, panoramic view, and instead we're going to focus on two stories which we are going to look at in depth, in which food plays fascinating, significant roles in what it gives to the story. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take some now. I see some things are in the chat. Barbara, very nice point about this sort of God, the food coming from God is sort of a harking back to Bereshit on God breathing life into us. That's lovely. Yes, Yehudi.
I notice you disregard the English translation that you're putting in front of us. I'm not exactly sure why you're doing that. But, I mean, I don't think uberachta means to bless. It means to give thanks. Essentially, you just, that's what the word means in Tanakh, when it applies to a human being's relationship with Hashem. In other words, when they take this to mean Birkat HaMazon, and they say that's min Torah, well, that might be what they want to make you believe, but that's not what the verse is saying. What the verse is saying is exactly what the English translation has in front of you. Baruch Hashem in Tanakh. When somebody says Baruch Hashem, they mean thank God, just like we do today. If you ask somebody how you're feeling, you say Baruch Hashem, which means thank God. Okay? I mean, I'm not, I realize this is a source text for Birkat Hamazon, but according to the plain Pashut Pshat, it has nothing to do with some written out nusach that the rabbis came up with and then proceeded to say that nusach is what this pasuk is talking about. In other words, that in itself is a drush.
I don't see much of a contradiction. A bracha is a way of thanking God, meaning when Chazal say this is the source for Birkat Hamazon, what they mean is the Torah says that once you have eaten, you give thanks to God. It is simply the halachic encasing. A bracha in this sense is the halachic encasing of giving thanks. So there's not really a contradiction between your saying that the word bracha means to give thanks, and this my point is simply to show that the way in which Jewish practice, of course, emerging from the Tanakh, views food as a way of connecting deeply to God, and that's the case whether you translate the verse as "You shall eat, be satisfied, and give thanks to God," or whether you view it as "You shall eat, be satisfied, and make a blessing to God." Either way, it's not too much.
It's not a commandment; it's a prediction. You get where I'm going with this? It's not a commandment; it's a prediction. It's like that's not a commandment; that's a prediction. Okay, even Abraham Ibn Ezra and Rashi argue about that. In other words, it simply means when you sit and eat your fill from the land I'm giving
you. But either way, Yehudi, the point that I was trying to make is that in the eyes of both Tanakh and the way in which Chazal view it, and I'm not so interested in the differences, I'm interested in what they share in common, is that food is the opportunity to not be something which is simply dangerous or simply materialistic, as it's described as being elsewhere, but actually as being the possibility for a wholesome relationship with God. I do realize now it's 2:30, so I don't want to keep people behind. I've enjoyed this very much, and look forward to seeing people again on Thursday. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I do just want to give a quick plug to our next session, which is tonight at 8 p.m. It is called Scarcity and Plenty in America, the Face of Hunger and Food Policy, which is with Mazon, the Jewish response to hunger. You can find out more information about this class and all of our other Winter's Month programming at www.drisha.org/classes. So thank you again, Rabbi Wolfson, for learning with us today. It was my pleasure to sit in on it. Thank you.
Thank you.